Today we are going to explore the subject of epidemics from the point of view of the esoteric philosophy. Theosophical teachings postulate that anything that happens in our planet is subjected to the law of karma, and that epidemics are also part of these dynamics. So let us see how epidemics are explained from this point of view. Let us start with the concept of the astral light. In her first book, Isis Unveiled, Blavatsky said, "How often have powerful clairvoyants and adepts in mesmerism described the epidemics and illnesses as their lucid vision or psychic vision saw them in the astral light. They affirm that the electric waves in the astral light were in violent perturbation, and that they discerned a direct relation between this ethereal disturbance and the mental or physical epidemic then raging." So what she says here is that when there is an epidemic, whether it is physical or a mental epidemic, she says that waves of suicides or waves of violence, these are kind of mental epidemics. So whenever these global events happen, those who have a psychic vision can see in the astral light electric waves, a perturbance, a kind of storm that is correlated to the epidemic going on at the time. So let's see what this astral light is. She described it as the invisible region that surrounds our globe, our planet, as it does every other planet, and corresponding as the second principle of cosmos, the third being life, of which it is the vehicle, to the linga sharira, or the astral double in man. So these are all technical words that she used in her description of the cosmos and human beings. She would say that there are 7 aspects to each solar system, galaxy, human being, or actually anything in nature. So the first aspect, the most concrete and obvious to us, is the physical body, a physical planet, etc. Then there is a second dimension, let's say, to any entity, and this is what she called linga sharira in applying a Sanskrit term. This linga sharira is like an ethereal body that surrounds any physical object. And this linga sharira is the one that is the vehicle for life, especially in biological entities. We are alive because the linga sharira is the bridge to bring prana or vitality into the body. So this astral light is the linga sharira of the planet, of the earth. So she continues saying, a subtle essence, this astral light is a subtle essence, visible only to a clairvoyant eye. And then she quotes Eliphas Levi, who was a priest and an occultist before her time. And she says, Eliphas Levi calls the astral light the great serpent, the dragon, from which radiates on humanity every evil influence. This is so, but why not add that the astral light gives out nothing but what it has received, that it is the great terrestrial crucible in which the vile emanations of the earth, moral and physical, upon which the astral light is fed, are all converted into this subtlest essence and radiated back, intensified, thus becoming epidemics, moral, psychic, and physical. So basically what she says, Eliphas Levi would say that from the astral light come evil emanations, evil influences. And Blavatsky says that is true, but this is only half of the story. Our own activity, mental, physical, emotional, psychic, is the one that feeds this astral light. So whatever the astral light is reflecting on us is whatever we put in this astral light, whatever we fed this astral light with. So this is the first concept that we have to keep in mind. There is this ethereal atmosphere around the planet, which is able to retain certain influences and to reflect them back on Earth. And this reflection manifests not only as epidemics, but also as earthquakes or as any natural phenomena that affects a large number of people. In her esoteric instructions, she identifies specifically what subplane within this astral light is the one that accumulates these evil emanations that are reflected on the earth. So she would say that it is the fourth, in her system, she divided any plane, and the astral light is a plane of nature. She divided any plane in 7 subdivisions. So she would say that it is in the 4th subdivision of this plane. She says this is the worst of the astral planes, karmic and terrible. Kama is a Sanskrit word that means desire. So she says, here are strewed the seeds of epidemics, of vice, of cycles of disasters, and general catastrophes of all kinds that happen in groups. A series of murders, of earthquakes, of shipwrecks. So you see, it is in the 4th subplane within the astral light that all these evil emanations are accumulated, and then they are reflected back on Earth in all kinds of disasters, natural or accidents. Now, what are these emanations that are absorbed by the astral light? And Ibesan explained, when men generate a large number of malignant thought forms of a destructive character, and when these congregate in huge masses on the astral plane, this is how she called the astral light, she called the astral plane, their energy may be and is precipitated on the physical plane, stirring up wars, revolutions, and social disturbances and upheavals of every kind, falling as collective karma on their progenitors and effecting widespread ruin. Epidemics of crime and disease, cycles of accidents, have a similar explanation. So you see, she says that when we generate a large number of malignant thought forms of a destructive character, then they are absorbed in the astral light, and then they are reflected on the earth. So it is humanity's psychological activity, by that I mean our thoughts and our emotions, which are the seeds for epidemics, for accidents, for natural disasters. In the Theosophical view, there is a direct connection between what is going on in our planet as a whole and the activity of human beings. So as we go in our lives, when our activity begins to be increasingly violent, divisive, with a kind of activity that doesn't take compassion into account, then all that influence little by little begins to accumulate in the astral light. So for example, she would say, let us see, she would explain a little more what thought forms and elementals are, because these are connected to this force that is absorbed by the astral light. So let us start with a quote from Mahatma K.H., who was a teacher of Blavatsky. He said, "Thoughts are things They have tenacity, coherence, and life. They are real entities. This was written in the 1880s, and it was one of the first times in our modern times that the idea that thoughts are actual forces, and not only forces, but as we are going to see, entities. This is one of the first times that this was postulated in the Western world. So Leadbeater describes what these thought forms that Annie Besant had mentioned are. He says, our feelings and thoughts generate definite forms in the matter which they respectively affect. The idea is that there are different kinds of matter. We are aware of the physical matter, but there is also emotional matter, mental matter, which are subtler forms, which perhaps we would call them energies, but they are material in a sense. They are something that can be seen by clairvoyance, for example. So our feelings and thoughts generate definite forms in the matter of their own planes, in the emotional plane and the mental plane. And these forms follow the thoughts and feelings which made them. When those thoughts and feelings are directed toward another person, the forms actually move through space to that person and impinge upon his aura, and in many cases blend themselves with it. So in this quote, the reason why we bring this quote is to show that these forms are forces that can be directed, that can affect individual people. Now, besides this effect on particular people or places, and the thought forms can be good or bad. When we think with love about on somebody, then all this love creates a real form that goes to that person. But at the same time, that love is being accumulated in what we can call a repository of goodness. Similarly, as we have seen, all these violent or aggressive or selfish thought forms and forms of emotion produced by our daily activity are accumulated in a repository, which is the astral light, and then they are reflected back on the physical plane, as we have seen. So Mahatma K.H. Says, every thought of man, upon being evolved, passes into the inner world and becomes an active entity by associating itself with an elemental, one of the semi-intelligent forces of the kingdoms of nature. It survives as an active intelligence, a creature of the mind's begetting, for a longer or shorter period proportionate with the original intensity of the cerebral or mental action which generated it. Thus, a good thought is perpetuated as an active, beneficent power, an evil one as a maleficent demon. So here we have not only the thought forms that we generate, but there is a kind of, there are some kinds of entities that in Theosophical literature are called elementals. These elementals are very primary forms of consciousness. This is why the Master KH here says semi-intelligent forces of nature, or the kingdoms of nature. And these are instinctive forces which they ensoul, they give energy to the thought forms that we generate, and then those thought forms can last for a long period of time. So what we are, every time we think or we feel, we are generating a form that can be ensouled by an elemental, and then that form becomes far more powerful. So when we, as a whole, as humanity, we generate a large amount of thought forms and emotions, forms made of emotions that are, as we were saying, violent, intolerant, selfish, they are ensouled by these elementals and they become quite powerful. William Judge said, an elemental is a center of force. Without intelligence, it's not self-aware. There is an instinctive nature there in a certain sense, but it's a very primary form of consciousness, as I said. So without intelligence, without moral character or tendencies, but capable of being directed in its movements by human thoughts, which may consciously or not give it any form, and to a certain extent, intelligence. So our thoughts give the elementals a form. This is what Besant Leadbeater would call thought forms. And our thoughts are the ones that give the direction to the influence of the elemental. Again, if we are thinking about somebody with a loving feeling, an elemental may ensoul that thought form and that emotion form, let's say, and the direction for the influence of that thought form is given by the thought form itself that was generated by the person. It's not that the elemental can decide what to do with that thought form. There is no intelligence in that sense in the elementals. So the elemental is just like the energy behind the thought forms, and we are the ones that direct these thought forms. And Blavatsky says the elemental world is automatic and like a photographic plate, all atoms continually arriving at and departing from the human system. So there are elementals always coming and going from our aura, let's say. And they are constantly assuming the impression conveyed by the acts and thoughts of that person. And therefore, if a person sets up a strong current of thought, he attracts elementals in greater numbers. So when there is an intensity, we attract more elementals. Intensity for good or intensity for bad feelings, for evil, let's say. So Annie Besant explains, when a man sends a thought form, it not only keeps up a magnetic link with him, but is drawn towards other thought forms of a similar type. And these congregating together on the astral plane form a good or evil force, as the case may be, embodied in a kind of collective entity. So you see here we are seeing the mechanics when we say that the astral light or the astral plane is being fed with our own thoughts. Here now we can understand the mechanics of this. When we generate thought forms, those thought forms tend to aggregate together with similar ones, whether they are good or evil, whether they are of love and compassion or of hatred and violence and intolerance. And they aggregate, they congregate on the astral plane, and they form a kind of collective entity. When this collective entity, as I have called it, is made up of thought forms of a destructive type, the elementals ensouling these act as a disruptive energy, and they often work much havoc on the physical plane. A vortex of disintegrating energies, they are the fruitful sources of accidents, of natural convulsions, of storms, cyclones, hurricanes, earthquakes, floods. So here we come back to what we started looking at the beginning, that it is all these thought forms generating from us that create this entity with the being ensouled by the elementals on the astral plane. And then that destructive energy that is that was attracted by our thought forms will be reflected on the physical plane. So there is a theosophist that wrote about epidemics from the theosophical standpoint that says the lessons theosophy teaches are important ones. Man is his brother's keeper, and the only permanent protection against plagues and calamities lie in the purification of the thought plane. It is a simple problem of cause and effect. If every man purifies his own thought sphere, the astral light will eventually be cleansed. So there is an ecology of the mind as there is an ecology of nature. We are constantly either polluting the mental atmosphere and the emotional atmosphere, or we are purifying it when we produce elevating thoughts and emotions. And as long as we are polluting the emotional and mental atmosphere with feelings of intolerance and hatred, then so long we will have to deal with the effects not only on the emotional and mental plane, but also on the physical plane. This is why people like Jesus or Buddha would say that hate cannot be solved by means of hate. That if we hate those who do something that we think is wrong, we are actually being part of the problem. We keep adding this destructive force. If we want to stimulate in society a change, we should never hate the other side, fight the other side. We should always try to encourage that which is good, to work for the good, not to work against evil. Because by working against evil, by trying to destroy evil, we are producing these destructive energies that will be reflected on the physical plane. So finally, to talk a little more about our attitude when we are dealing with these epidemics, either moral or physical, Anibesan says that when disease spread, in the case of epidemics, and the thoughts of fear which follow their progress act directly as strengthened of the power of the disease. So fear strengthens the power of the disease. Magnetic disturbances are set up and propagated and react on the magnetic spheres of people, on the aura of people within the affected area. Because diseases are not just a physical manifestation, they are a manifestation from the astral plane. Fear moves on the astral plane. So the fear that is generated by people spreads on the astral plane and weakens people. So it is very important for those who are interested in these teachings to try to maintain calm and a certain sense of poise and confidence while we are going through these difficulties. Many people cannot act correctly unless they are moved by fear. But those who are interested in these teachings should be beyond that. They should be able to act in a responsible way, but without fear. Because when we are afraid, we are, again, being part of the problem. So this is a service that we can give to the world. We are constantly emanating what we are. We are constantly speaking out our being. So by keeping calm, acting responsibly, and trying to send goodwill to the environment, we are helping in the different crises that we have to face. Leadbeater says, the man who has no fear of contagious disease is less likely to be infected by it than the man who is always in terror of it. Any clairvoyant who watched the conditions produced both in the astral body and in the etheric part of the physical vehicle by nervousness and fear will easily understand why this should be, and will see the immunity of the fearless man is explicable on purely scientific grounds. So we know today at the level of science that fear weakens the immune system. But the effect of fear also happens on non-physical levels, on this ethereal aspect of the physical body, what Blavatsky called the Linga Sharira, and also on our astral body and our emotional body. So it is not that if we are not afraid, we are not going to contract an illness. But if we are not afraid, we our defenses will be stronger. So keeping calm is good not only for all humanity, but also for every individual. So in this time of distress, of fear, let us be a source of calm and confidence. And finally, Annie Besant gives us a piece of advice because, as I was mentioning, fear is in the atmosphere. And then if we are sensitive, we will feel that fear. We will be affected by the external fear. So Annie Besant says, as we evolve our astral bodies, they not only receive more impressions from the astral plane, but pass them on more to the physical body. And so we find the mood of great depression coming over us, for which we cannot in any way account. She was talking about in general, when sometimes we get these moods that are not really produced by a physical happening, but something that happened on the physical plane. But this, of course, can be applied to any time, and especially in times of crisis, we have all this unrest on the astral plane. And we perceive it through the astral body, and that impression is sent to the physical body. So we feel the fear, for example, that it's not necessarily ours. So she says, now very often such a mood is simply an overshadowing from the astral plane, with which we have really no more to do ourselves than the stream which is shadowed by the cloud has directly to do with the cloud. So this is like a shadow from the astral plane that falls on us. People, for instance, who feel strongly about public matters, who are deeply interested in the welfare of large numbers of their fellow men, such people will feel very heavy depression sometimes from public calamities which are impending or going on at the time. So those people who are sensitive, who care about what is going on with humanity, they tend to be more susceptible to feel the whatever is going on the astral plane. So this makes this kind of times more challenging for those who are sensitive, for those who are compassionate. But it is now when it is required from us that we exert all our will, our power, our love, our poise, so that we don't become absorbed by the general atmosphere, and we can reflect back confidence instead of adding to the general fear. So Annie Besant tells us here what to do when this happens. So what then can a person do when a mood of this sort comes along? The only way I know of meeting those is by the clear, definite recognition of the law, the feeling that nothing can come to us or to others which is not within the law, within karma, the feeling that whatever comes is working to a good purpose and for a good end. All these calamities that seem from the physical plane seem so bad, they are actually working out for the evolution of the souls. Even if the bodies die, the souls are eternal. And all this activity, all these experiences, we have died many times in the past, we will die many times in the future. But everything that happens has a very specific purpose, has the purpose of helping the soul to realize its divine nature. So suffering is a blessing in disguise. It's not that we have to be happy when somebody suffers, but we have to know that that suffering is at the same time producing some kind of growth in the soul. So this is what Annie Besant says, we need to have a clear understanding of this, and this is why it is important to study Theosophical teachings so that we understand fully this. And then this understanding can become a source of support when we have to face these difficult times. So she says the intense inner conviction that just as when the trouble comes and we see it and understand it, we deliberately train ourselves to accept it and live through it. So we are to deal with this vaguer, in this way, we are to deal with these vaguer and obscurer things, with these feelings that come to us, based on an intense conviction of this idea that everything is working out for good. Then based on that, we can train ourselves to accept what we are going through and to do our best to try to be a source of peace, even in a time of crisis.